Relative auto-transposable mode rotatable system, 12 collections times 7 modal perspectives, no rewriting required. The way music was actually designed to be. If only it could break free from the shackles of history, shackles imposed by writing that musical information down, freezing it, if you will, in black and white, in textbooks, in sheet music, it now being liberated, now becoming fluid once more with the help and use of technology. Technology allowing us to easily translate, transpose, modally rotate the musical information. In other words, in prior presentations, we talked about some of the limitations of the current ways that we write down our musical information, our songs, our tunes, our melodies, the primary form being the sheet music. This time we'll address some of those limitations and discuss why we could come up with a better system and why this is the time to do that better system, because once again, we have the technology, primarily the technology to easily translate information, remembering that musical systems are way easier to translate than even languages. Latin to English is much more difficult than a musical system to a different musical system. The musical system is a one-to-one translation. We can take all the textbooks and we can translate all the textbooks very easily because the translation is quite easy to do. The only question is then, is it more efficient to do that? Is there a more efficient way to do it? If there is, then the fact that the information has been frozen in time by the benefit, the blessing of writing information down, textbooks and sheet music, does not stop us from evolving a better system any longer, because we can become fluid. It's taken out of the mire, we're out of the mar, we're out of the tar pits, we have the capacity. So design goals, what we want to do, we want to write once, play anywhere, transpose across all 12 collections without rewriting. We're going to go into more detail of each of these as we go through the presentation. We would like to rotate modes, instantly change tonic by rotating the modal dial. So we'd like to be easily, particularly if you're using a DAW system or a MIDI, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to have at least two what you can think of as dials that would easily rotate the information. But even if you're doing this by hand, you should also be able to easily transpose or write the information in the most efficient way to transpose the information. So 1 octave equals 1 row. See chords and notes cleanly. Expand to stack view when needed. In other words, the sheet music is kind of a stack kind of format that we have envisioned in the past, and a DAW system stacks all the musical information of an octave in one place. So we should be able to compact that or expand it. So relative position notation, permanent degree numbers, optional 0.5 degrees for chromatic tones. This is going to get into how exactly should we be writing down the information, particularly moving away possibly from some of the problems that will be introduced to people that don't know the piano as data input when you're working in a DAW system, for example. Chord modules, name by chord mode and number of notes. So in other words, we should be naming our chords in such a way that they're going to be easily translatable and rotatable. At least the back end of the system of a DAW should have the capacity to do that. But if you're writing down musical ideas, you should also do that automatically, because it's the most efficient way to write down your musical ideas so that you can tinker with them as easy as possible. 10-key typewriter input, numbers for degrees, and so on. So we'll talk about how to input the musical information into, say, a DAW, which might be more efficient than using the musical computer of yesteryear, which is, of course, the piano. So 2 dials. So the core idea here is that, and this is just, again, just from a functional standpoint, the way the music system is designed is so that we're always working from the perspective of a 7-note collection. Now, we have access to all 12 notes, but we're always working from the perspective of there's 7 notes within the collection. The other notes are kind of outside the collection. Even if you're a complex jazz player, most of the time you're still thinking, what's the 7-note collection? What's the tonic that I'm basically playing in? So that then is the way the DAW system should basically be designed as well, giving us basically 2 dials so that we can write down our information from relative perspectives and then adjust that information in a way that's most musically aligned, kind of like a Rubik's Cube should be snapping, should be rotating in that format. So we have collection, we have 12 positions, choosing the 7-note set, the key collection. So in other words, we can name the 7-note collection from any mode. In other words, I can name each of the 7 modes and the collection from there, but traditionally we name things by the major collection of notes. So we have 12 notes. We apply the major formula to say that we have 12 collections of 7 notes, basically, and then we can choose kind of like the tonic is, I think, the most efficient way to put the information together. So Modal, 7 positions, choosing the modal center. So once you know the collection of notes, then you can choose the modal center. Like there's 7 notes in the collection. You can Nashville number them 1 through 7, which has a permanent modal name, Ionian, Dorian, Locrian nodes. So then you choose the collection of notes, you choose the modal center. Most of the time people just say I'm playing in like D Dorian, right? But it would be easier to say I'm playing in the collection of notes around C major, and the 2 or the Dorian is going to be the modal center. Either way will work. We should be able to have flexibility in like a DAW system for however people are seeing the musical information. Change either dial, no rewriting, the view remaps automatically. So in other words, if we write all of our music, even if it's not in a DAW, with relative perspective, then I don't have to do anything to transpose. All I have to do is say, I'm going to change the collection of notes from C major to D major. And everything is already written in a way that you can see it, even if you write it by hand. If you're writing in a DAW system, then you have to tell it which collection of notes that you're viewing the information from, so it can basically play it back to you just like you would in like a band situation. So in other words, if this is a DAW, don't worry about the numbers over here. Just worry about the alignment to the rows. Normally we think of basically we have the pitch going up in this way in a DAW type system. So this would be like the middle C going up. The red represents 12 notes going up in pitch. And notice that we have all notes represented here. Now, some DAWs will kind of highlight if you're going to be playing in Ionian or if you're playing in Dorian or something, which of the notes are in the key. But still, you have all the notes and it's kind of expanded. It's a long expanded format to see things. This right here represents the absolute numbering system, typically for a DAW, which isn't something that we as human beings are used to. But notice that this C up top has a different number than this C because it's taking into consideration the octave. Now this column over here is giving us the relative position. So now I'm going to number this. Notice the numbers go 1, and then I skip 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. In other words, I'm applying the formula of whole step to the whole number, whole step to the whole number, half step to the whole number, whole step to the whole number, whole step to the whole number, whole step to the whole number. We still have the ability to play the other notes, but I'm numbering them with respect or to the 7-note collection. Why is that important? Well, if I then want to play in D, notice the whole thing shifts up. So now I'm playing in D. Don't worry about the number over here. That should be 62, but let's just imagine it's an X. So now, but I also moved this column up. So that D now is being represented by the 1 relative position, meaning it's D major, meaning I'm applying the same formula this way. So I have everything has been moved up relative, meaning I just transposed it from C major to D major and the whole thing moves up. That should clearly be something that a DAW should be able to do automatically to be able to move up your song to any of the collections of notes. That should be quite easy to do. Here we do the same thing. We moved it up to F. So once again, this column is moving up, meaning it's going to be F Ionian or F major. But I could also move this up if I start at the same point right here, and then I move this up. This time I moved it up to the D, right? So I moved it up to the D, but I didn't change this column over here. Why is this one's not playing? I didn't choose this column over here. So that means that this is actually the Dorian. So it's going up from the Dorian. So notice that's different because the notes up top aren't exactly the same. If I go back up here, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 between this note and this note, between the F and the A. But here it's 1, 2, 3 because it's a major third versus a minor third. So that's going to be, so notice this is allowing us the other dial of saying, I don't want to just transpose everything from a C major to a D. I want to rotate the modal center. And as I rotate the modal center, the D now becomes the lowest note in our collection of notes, but I've also adjusted it to the perspective of the D, meaning there's going to be some slight adjustments up top as we do the modal rotation. So I would think that a current DAW system should have the capacity to do this, right? And then if I moved it up here to the E, I moved it up to the E, but instead of moving this up, which means it would be in the Ionian, it's now on the 3. So it's on the related Phrygian. So now as I move up, this also is a minor distance between this note and this note because the Phrygian is a minor mode, but now the E is now the lowest note in the collection of notes, and we've adjusted the pattern to be in the Phrygian. That's the idea. Those two dials should be in place on a DAW system, and we should be able to write our music in such a way that we can actually do it, even if I wrote it by hand, pretty easily to make those adjustments. All right, so the relative positions notation. So degrees labeled 1 through 7 for in-collection notes. So in other words, the Nashville number system basically is what we're talking about. We have a 7-note collection. However, I'm going to keep those 7 positions permanent. I don't care which point is the modal center. We're going to say that whatever number it is, 1 through 7, which is Ionian through Locrian from a modal standpoint, will be the same numbering system. Okay, so then the 5 chromatic tones labeled as 0.5. So you might say, well, if you do that, that would be like playing all the white keys on the piano. You don't get any flavor by moving outside the key. But of course, you can still add those notes. It's just that I'm going to put them in between, adding them as a 0.5. And then when I do the data input, if someone's learning to play in a DAW, they should be able to play everything with just 7 notes and then define what their modal center is. And everything's going to go up from there. That would be the easiest way to teach someone to play music theory without getting them bogged down with piano theory, which kind of gets messed up because of the size of the keys. And then we can add the 0.5s as we need to, but of course it'll be very specific to add those ones because those are going to be outside the collections of notes. So we have the 1.5, the 2.5, the 3.5, which is NA. There is no 3.5 because the formula is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So 4.5, 5.5, and then 6.5. So absolute octave when needed. So in other words, you're going to say from a Nashville number system, we have 1 through 7 numbers. And then it starts over because you're going around in a clock kind of format, going around a lap. But you could keep on going up just like we do with the absolute numbering system for the notes. So I could say after I go from 1 to 7, keep on going up to 8 and then 9 and so on and add the 0.5s. So that gives us the capacity in a DAW system, for example, to then add the octaves and do what we need to do with the octaves. So result, we have all 12 tones are reachable without abandoning relative logic. So now you see we have the notes over here. These are the local distant notes. This is the numbering system for the notes that are absolute, meaning the C up here is 72 versus 60. And this is the relative position, 1 through 7 with the 0.5s in the middle, and then it goes up to 8, 8.5, 9, as opposed to it's starting over again. So this capacity over here allows us to take into consideration octaves as we rotate the dial in our system. Okay, so 1 octave, 1 row. A single row shows 12 columns. So in other words, instead of doing this, where we have 12 rows, that gets quite messy. A DAW system should be able to compact that. And if you're writing the information, sheet music kind of compacts it a little, but it cheats because it does this sharps and flats thing. So you're kind of working in the sharps and flats kind of world. But that doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you're on a piano and you're visualizing the numbers of sharps and flats as a different shape because of the different dimensions of the keys of the piano. Otherwise, that's totally useless, right? But it's too much, right? So we'd like to be able to write it more condensedly. If you're writing music, writing a song, jotting down your musical ideas, I would like to have this entire column condensed down into one row, and the next column for another row, possibly, if I want to be going up an octave. I would like that one row that I'm using to be able to express singular notes as well as common note combinations known as chords, right? So that's why we could have one single row for the 12 notes. Chord displayed as filled cells and rows, and expand, collapse. We should be able to expand or collapse them. So this is what it would look like if we collapse down. Just this orange spot would represent the same thing that we had in the long format, in this format. So we have, now the chord names I'm showing here as I believe that they should be written in the most efficient way. Now, if obviously you're going to say, well, that's not how people know the chords. That's fine. You can write it any way you want. But if you're teaching someone music theory in a DAW and not with a piano, you probably want to tell them, look, this is Nashville number 1, a 3-note chord, and then how to stack a 3-note chord. This is a Dorian chord or a Nashville number 2, 4-note chord, for example. These here are being represented not as notes, but the Nashville numbers. Now, even if you're writing your song by hand, I would say this is a more efficient way to write it. Why? Because if this song is in a major key, and I do know that because the tonic, Ionian is the tonic, the 1, Ionian is the tonic, then I could be any of the 12 major keys, right? All I have to do is say, I'm going to say this is now I want to use the collection of notes related to C major. Now this is, I don't have to rewrite it. I already know the relative positions to C major. If it's in G major, then I'm just going to say, okay, it's in G major. The 1 now represents the G, is now the Ionian. All the relative positions move up. But you should also be able to see it this way in a DAW. So if you wanted to assign the collection of notes and say, I'm playing in the collection of notes around a C major, the 7 notes around C major, which you would need to do in a DAW in order to play back the DAW, but the DAW could still represent it without the C in there so that you could see the relative positionness of it. And that's useful for people learning to write in a DAW, because then the writing will be the same for all. Like if I'm writing in Ionian, it doesn't matter which collection of notes I'm writing in. The relative song formatting will all be the same. Instead of learning 12 different ways to write the music, right? With 12 different collections of notes. But if you want to play it this way, C major, D minor 7, E minor 9, and so on and so forth, the chords here, and then the notes. So if you're writing a song, it shouldn't matter if you're writing the melody or if you're writing the chords. We're going to have both of those are fittable into one row. It's only when you do a complex chord and you stack something that's outside the key possibly, where you might need another row that's within the same 12-note collection, which you could add. And again, a DAW should be able to add that information as well. And then go up here if you're moving up another octave. So in other words, also, this middle octave, you might say, well, what is that? Is that C4 on the piano? It has to be static. It doesn't really have to be static, right? It could be, if I'm in playing in the key of C, then yeah, that's C4, and this row represents 12 notes up from C4. But if I was in D major, the lowest note in this collection of notes should be what we might say is D4, right? D4, 12 notes up from D4. So this row should be a 12-note collection relative to the lowest note in the collection of notes defined by what you've assigned it to be, right? Is it the node? So then if we expand it, this now represents it. So again, if you're in a DAW, I should be able to represent this either way, in expanded format, so now I can see the chord, or a contracted format. Notice that if I write in a DAW currently, I have to write this way. There could be some shortcuts. I could say just enter a C major and it'll do that. But then when I go back and read it, I have to know what that pattern is in order to recognize that that's a C major chord. Whereas if it was able to compact it this way, then me as a reader should say, oh, that's a C major, and then I can jump this way, and that's what the stacked C major looks like. I should be able to go back and forth. So chord modal names without notes. So chords specified by mode size, e.g. 3-note Ionian. In other words, in order to make your sheet music, or even if you're writing by hand, transposable, the most efficient way to write it is not to make reference to the note names. You should just be making reference to the relative position. So instead of saying it's a C major triad, you just say it's an Ionian triad, or it's a Dorian triad, or if you're adding the 7, it's a 4-note a 4-note Ionian or a 4-note Dorian. Why? Because then you don't have to rewrite anything. It does. If you could just transpose it to all the collections of notes. Optional case for tonic prominence. So 3I. So if you're saying it's 3I, it's a 3-note Ionian. You could make it a capital I, and that will indicate the tonic. That's one way that you can indicate the tonic. If you're writing out chords and you're using letters instead of numbers, instead of like the Nashville number 1, you're using an I for Ionian. If you make it a capital I, that could be indicating that's the tonic of the song that you're playing in. Complex chords, outside tones, you can add the 0.5 degrees. Now, obviously, when we do the stacking thing, in a DAW, all normal chords should be available to us, meaning all chords created from the normal 7 notes in the collection from any of the 7-note perspectives. It's only complicated when you add the 5 notes outside, you would think, to the chords, right? So all the normal chords should be addable. It's only when you add something that's in a different octave, or it's inverted somehow, or something like that, where you might have to do something funny with note stacking that wouldn't look nice and neat as you compact everything. And those notes could be represented by, once again, the 0.5s. Benefit, instantly translate, matches the ear's modal function. So here's all the chords. Now, here's like the normal major chords. So you have a C major 7, C major 9, C major 11. Here's from the perspective of the Lydian, which the relative Lydian is an F major 7, F major 9, but then you have an F major sharp 11 and so on. And these are from the perspective of the Mixolydian, which is a G major, and then G7, G9. And then from the minors, you've got an A minor 7, A minor 9, A minor 11, A minor flat 13 from the Dorian perspective, D minor, and so on. From the E Phrygian perspective, you have to have these extensions down here, and then here's from the Dorian's perspective. Now, the easier way to write these would be something like this kind of format. It's a 3-note Ionian, because then it's just like the same thing, except now I'm not referring to the C. I'm just saying it's an Ionian. It could be any collection of notes. I have to then just say which collection of notes I'm working in, and that would be easier. The reason I don't like to say Ionian 3 is because I'd rather write it this way. It's an Ionian 2, because the 2 should represent the distance that we're going, 2 modal whole steps from the Ionian, rather than an Ionian 3. So I'd rather say it's like a 3 Ionian, but then when you put the 3 up top, the system might be saying that you're trying to put 1 note instead of, so that's some data input thing. But it could have a capital to see if it's the tonic. You can also name it by range, meaning it's the Ionian to the Lydian from a modal, to the Mixolydian from a modal range, or Ionian to Mixolydian chord. So that's what that means. So in other words, you could write it this way, like an F major, but the system should be able to rewrite it this way, like a 3-note Lydian, which allows the system then to transpose easily, right? If the system is writing it with an F, then it's going to be more difficult to transpose it. If you say the system's going to see it as a 3-note Lydian, and then you tell it that we're in the collection of notes so that it's this relative to the C major collection, it'll know that's an F, and then it can transpose everything automatically. So the system should be, if you write the information this way traditionally, the system should be able to see it behind the scenes this way to make the transposition easily. But I would propose that you would like to write your chords this way, or this way, because those mean that you're writing your songs in such a way that you can play them in any 12 collections of notes. You can transpose them automatically and possibly even rotate them, adjusting the modal center as you do. So then if we see that here, you can see this is the C major, D major, these are the chords, but I should be able to also see them this way. The C major is now a note 3 Ionian. It's a 3-note Ionian chord. The D was a D minor is a note 4 Dorian chord, and so on. So input, playing like a typist. So we have the 10 key and or assign keys for the 7-note collection. So in other words, if you're entering information into a DAW, the two ways to do it right now is either you use your mouse to put the information in, or that's not efficient. You could use the data input of plugging in like a MIDI piano, little piano. But the problem is the piano isn't the most efficient way to enter into a computer, even though it's a beautiful instrument and was the musical computer of the past. Because if you're entering into a computer, then especially if you don't know the piano, you don't want to introduce the theory problems that come with a piano. Like if someone's writing in a computer, it would be easiest to tell them music theory of just saying, pick your collection of notes, and there's going to be whatever collection of notes you pick. There's going to be 7 notes in the collection. One of those notes will be the tonic, and there's going to be 5 notes outside the collection. Therefore, you can get quite fast at that, just playing within the 10 key, possibly having a toggle so that you can basically toggle up and down octave-wise with arrows or some other kind of note. And you can assign the 5 notes that are outside the key to something else, right? You can assign them to the 5 notes on your left hand if you want to play something outside the key, or possibly just assign part of the keyboard in here to the 7 notes in the key with your left hand, and maybe the 5 notes that are out of the key on the right hand, or maybe an octave up top and below. There's got to be a whole number of more efficient ways to do the data input with a normal typewriter keyboard than the piano. Again, not because the piano isn't a beautiful instrument, but it's not symmetrical. It's not a symmetrical instrument. And so when we're entering it into the computer, we're usually working within one octave. So you might as well number it. It would be most efficient for most people to just say, oh, there's 7 numbers inside the key. One of those numbers is going to be the tonic for any song, or at least any part of the song, right? That would be the most efficient way to do it, I would think. So then as I type the information in, I could use a typewriter to enter the actual note names and play that as a musical instrument with the notes, and then actually type in the chords, but it would be more efficient to do it this way, right? So if I had a 10 key, most of the notes I'm going to be playing aren't going to have a 0.5. They're just going to be 1 through 7. And then whatever I'm playing in, if I'm playing in Ionian, the 1 is going to be the lowest note in that octave in this collection of notes. It's going to go up in pitch from this octave, right? And then if I want to type in a chord, then that's why I put an N first. So I can say, look, this is a chord. This is the number of notes. It's going to be a 3-note Ionian, or a 3-note 1, meaning the first Nashville number. It's a 3-note 1 chord, a 4-note 2 chord, or something like that. And then I can only move up or down when I'm going up or down an octave. Transpose and rotate, non-destructive. So transpose, spin the collection dial, all chord notes remap. Rotate modes, spin the mode dial, tonic and interval qualities update. So in the system, obviously we should be able to transpose automatically. Even if you write it by hand, you should be able to transpose it automatically. The mode transposition is a little bit more complex, but it still should be doable if we write it as efficiently as we can. So the snapping rule for outside the tones. In other words, what if I'm rotating from Ionian to Dorian node? Well, then I'm going to have to adjust it somehow. The relative numbers are going to move up. Now, if you wrote the entire song in all notes that are in the key, everything will rotate up beautifully, no problem. and that's not a problem. But if you wrote with notes that are outside the key, like you had a 2.5, then it would rotate to a 3.5 relative Nashville number perspective. There is no 3.5, which means you'd have to snap it up possibly to a 4. So if you're writing singular notes, then when we rotate it, whenever you hit a note that's out that doesn't work because you rotated it up, you're going to have to move it up one or move it down one or do something with that note, right? So my rule is to move it up one. If it's a chord and it's a 3-note Ionian chord, then it works automatically because the chord is going to move from an Ionian to a Dorian. So now the definition of a 3-note Dorian chord already assigns it as having a minor third instead of a major third. So the chords work automatically, right? Because the chords are going to be put into place based on the structure of the chord name. Meaning, is it a 3-note chord, a 4-note chord, a 5-note chord, a 6-note chord, or a 7-note chord, which will automatically snap into place. Okay, so like if I had a 3-note Ionian chord, a 4-note Dorian chord, and these are the numbers, 1, 1.5. So this is the melody kind of side, and this is me entering chords. The chords, when I change this, when I rotate the dial from a 3-note Ionian, it's just going to be then a 3-note Dorian, which means now the D, if it's relative to this collection of notes of C major, will be D. Well, now the D will be the lowest note in the collection of notes, and it'll have a minor third distance instead of a major third, defined by the fact that now it will be a Dorian chord. No problem. If I have these individual notes, the 1 will become a 2, Ionian to Dorian. The 2 will become a 3, which will be Dorian to Phrygian, and then the 3 will become a 4, Phrygian to Lydian, 4 will become a 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 7, and then 7 will become 8 or 1, right? That's a little tricky because the 1 in the Dorian will be lower. We'll talk about that. But the problem here comes with this one that's outside the key. A 2.5 is outside the key. That'll transfer to a 3.5. There is no 3.5. That's where the snapping happens. So it's only the one that's outside the key that's going to cause a problem where you might have to snap. Now, if it was going from a 4.5 to a 5.5, the 5.5 is still a relevant Nashville number. You don't need to snap. So it's the time that you have a problem is if I rotate the dial up one modal perspective and then I come up with a relative number of a 3.5 or 7.5. That's a problem, right? So in other words, if I rotate this up, now I have the chords is a 3-note Dorian. Beautifully, all the chords work beautifully. You can rotate them, and the chord names will now define the proper intervals that will now be in relation to the Dorian. The 1 became a 2, the 1.5 became a 2.5, the 2 became a 3, the 3 became a 4, the 2.5 became a 3.5, which snapped to 4, right? And then the 3 became a 4, the 4 became a 5, and so on and so forth. Up here we have 2 1s. Notice that if I'm playing in Dorian, the idea would be I'm not going to make Dorian the 1 now. What I'm going to do is say, no, I'm still playing the same 7 notes, but the 2, which is now the Dorian, which if it's in the collection of notes of the key of C, is now the D Dorian, will be the lowest note in the collection. So as long as I know that the 2 is the lowest note in the collection, it's going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, and the 1 will be lower than the 2, then that's all I need to know, right? All I need to know is that if I'm playing in the Dorian, the 2 is going to be the lowest note. If I'm playing in the Ionian, the 1 will be the lowest note. If I'm playing in the Phrygian, the 3 will be the lowest note. So if I move this up to Phrygian, notice the mapping now, the chords map out automatically. So now I have a 3-note Phrygian and so on and so forth. They will snap into place automatically because of the chord names. And now when I look at these, notice I'm not going to be pulling the information from here, meaning I'm not doing a string from the Ionian to the Dorian and then the Dorian to the Phrygian. No, instead I'm going back to the original Ionian to Phrygian. So if I go from the Ionian, it was a 1, I'm going to add 2 to it because I'm turning the dial 2 dials up. So the 1's going to become a 3. The 1.5 is now not a problem. Well, the 1.5 now is the problem because it's going to be 2, 3.5. That's the one that's going to land us out. That's the one that's going to become a 4. The 2 is going to be 2, 3, 4. The 2.5 is now not a problem because it's going to be 2, 3, 4.5. That's in the relative position. So if I move the dial 2 up from that Ionian, I end up with the 1 became a 3, the 2 became, the 1.5 became a 3.5, which snapped up to 4, right? The 2 became a 4, and then the 2.5 became a 4.5, and so on and so forth. And so now you can see how that rotation happens. And obviously if I'm on the Phrygian, then the 3 is going to be the lowest in this 12-note collection, which in this case, if it was the collection of notes around the C major, the Phrygian would be an E. So the E would now be the lowest note, and this orange space would be representing 12 half steps up from that point, which is being represented with the Nashville numbers, meaning that the 1 and the 2 are going to be higher in pitch than the 3. All right, and then so Lydian, same thing. All the keys move up. I just rotate the dial. Once again, I'm rotating the dial not 1 notch up from the Phrygian. I'm rotating the dial up 3 notches from the Ionian. The Ionian is the 1. I move the dial 3 up to get to 1 plus 3, or 4. 4 modal half steps up from the Ionian is the Lydian, the 4, and now we rotate the whole thing up. Now the 4 is the lowest note number-wise, meaning if I go up in pitch, the 1, the 2, and the 3, and the 1 point, these are going to be higher in pitch than the 4. So it's going to be an octave up, an octave higher than the 4, right? And then so I can also represent that this way. So we have the key of C. So this would be the Ionian, represented by the 1, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 and then it keeps on going up. Notice that when I look at this, the amount that's in the orange area here, the bass note might be in the orange area. Like this one has the A is in the orange area, but it's actually reaching because I'm writing the chord in normal convention. So if this is some kind of A chord, an A minor of some kind, it's going to be going up. I'm not letting it invert the chord. So I'm trying to have normal convention where it's not inverted and it's going up this way. Now if I go to the Dorian, notice now this dial represents the 2 because the 2 Dorian. Everything snapped into place because this, for example, chord was 1, 2, 3 notes up. Now because I'm defining this as a Dorian chord mapped off of the 2 relative position, it's 3 notes up automatically. And you can see this pattern right here is just showing the notes that are going up normally. You can see this pattern gets a little wonky right here because of these 2 snaps, right? Those are the snaps that had to happen. And then if I go here, now we're on the 3. Now this, again, I'm moving this up from the Ionian, 2 up from the Ionian. The 3 is a Phrygian. It's still going to have a minor third distance, 1, 2, 3, instead of 4 notes away. And you can see where the snaps are basically happening on this one, right? And so on. So handling the 5 chromatic tones. So keep them visible as 0.5 degrees in the row. So in other words, we're not saying I'm just playing a simple system with only 7 notes that are in the key. No, the other 5 are available. They're just clearly defined as 0.5 outside of the key, and you're playing whole numbers 1 through 7 for the notes in the key. So styling, you might have lighter color outline to indicate outside the origin cells, as is the case with some DAWs already and some MIDIs. Rotation, transposition, carry them. Snapping occurs only when the target mode lacks the exact semitone slot. So we talked about that, meaning if I'm going from the Ionian to the Dorian, the 2.5 is going to move up 1 to the 3.5. That means it's going to have to snap to 4, right? Or you have to do something to it. That's the convention that I have used. That way, though, you can transpose everything beautifully, as we just saw. Selections with different centers. So mark regions. Each region can declare its own collection plus a mode. Rotate, transpose per region of the whole song. So enables a Rubik's Cube style tinkering without destructive edits. So you might be saying, hey, look, A more complex song, that's good for simple songs because you're going to play the whole song in an Ionian mode or the whole song in a Dorian with the same collection of notes. But what if I'm a jazz player, man, and I'm like playing like in one collection of notes and then I'm switching to another collection of notes? Notice the jazz player usually isn't thinking of a 12-note collection and just freestyling within the 12-note collection. They're usually still thinking, what is my tonic? I'm moving the modal center in my mind, or I'm moving the collection of notes in my mind in some way. So we're usually still thinking, most music in Western music is still thinking in terms or some context of a 7-note collection and a modal center. But it might change within the song. So that means like if I had this song, to be more specific, instead of saying the whole song is in one thing, like an Ionian mode. So in other words, to write this out, I'd have to say, look, I'm writing something out. I want to play this song in the collection of notes around C major, and I want it to be centered around the Ionian. And if I do that, then I can just type things in with the 1 through 7 and have the relative chords. But I might do that just for this part of the song. And this part of the song, I might be saying, hey, look, now I'm moving up to the related same collection of notes, but I'm looking at this from the perspective of the Phrygian. And then maybe I move up here and I'm saying, now I'm looking at the perspective of the Mixolydian. Or maybe I'm actually changing the collection of notes in some way. So I should be able to assign the parts of the song the way I'm thinking about it, right? The way I'm thinking about it. It shouldn't just be like I'm just assigning notes and you have to guess like what perspective is in my mind. Like if I just write random notes, what do we end up doing? We're like, oh, what is he thinking right here? Is he thinking he's an Ionian? It kind of sounds like he switched to Phrygian. He's in a different collection of notes over here. Well, no, you should tell us that, right? That you tell the system, like, yeah, I'm in Ionian. This is the collection of notes around the C. Maybe this switched to my mind is switching to Phrygian. That's how I'm seeing it in Mixolydian. Why is that important? Because then I can rotate the entire song musically easily. Meaning I can now say, I want the whole song to rotate, transpose the whole song, moving it all up, within 12-note collections relative to these positions. But I can also rotate it modally, the whole song, meaning the Ionian part would rotate if I move it one dial up to the Dorian. The Phrygian, which is the 3, would move up 1 to the 4. And then the Mixolydian would be moving up from the 5 to the 6, Aeolian, right? Or I can take any one of these and say, look, I want to change this Mixolydian, this part of the song, to maybe a different collection of notes where I'm keeping these the same. Or I want to take this Mixolydian and I want to just change the dial of this Mixolydian from the 5 to the 6, make it an Aeolian. You see, that's a musical way, that seems to me to be much more musical way to have a Rubik's Cube to tinker with. The way the current system is you have to change every single note in the song or copy and paste a whole thing and move it, transpose it like that way on one giant grid. Whereas I should be able to see it even in a compact view this way and be able to use the 2 dials to rotate the entire song or any piece of the song in a way that's the most musically common way to do that. That being transpose the thing to a different collection of notes or rotate the thing, adjusting the modal center and rotating the modal center, right? That's going to be the idea. So enter the legacy view. So export staff. So we should also be able to take this stuff from a DAW and be able to transpose it easily because, again, music is one-to-one. So if you write it in this format, you should be able to write it in any format you want, really, in a modern DAW. You could still use any view that you want, and it should be able to go back and forth. But once we write it, it should be able to create staff, tab, MIDI notes, DAW clips on a piano roll. I mean, this is like we're in the computer age right here. You can see it in any way you want, you would think. You should be able to import chord, melody, RPN. So in other words, at this point in time, the reason we can do this is because all the music that we had before, the only reason you can come up with to say, why wouldn't we do things more efficiently, is to say, this is the way we've always done it. All the texts are written down this way. If we change things, we won't be able to interface or connect with, read what has been done in the past. So the argument would be, yeah, it's more efficient to do that, but we're stuck because the thing's been put in stone at this point in time. But it's not, because now you can easily translate. Everything is translatable, right? You can, even a chat thing should be able to translate it. So you should be able to enter music in any format that should be able to be translatable in a current system, right? In a current DAW or a music system. And if you can't, you can use AI, a chatbot, to make the conversion. So this should be convertible to this, and both of these should be convertible to a relative position. You should be able to put it into a DAW, a stacking format, a sheet music format, or a condensed one-line relative position modal format. They're all one-to-one translations, easier to translate than language. So problems, solutions mapped, the chord stacking, row chords plus expand to stack on demand. So we should be able to view it as a stack if we want to, or compress it. Piano-centric UI, meaning we no longer have to enter with a piano, even though the piano is beautiful. It's not the way that we should be teaching music theory to people that don't know a piano, that are trying to learn how to do data input for other things using the DAW as their instrument. So upside down instrument look, instrument agnostic row view. In other words, we're still kind of doing a rising pitch thing when we look at the stack view, but we're also looking at it in rows. In other words, when we look at the guitar, we talked about with the tablature, it would be better to actually have the notes going down, because that's how they happen in a guitar. But in a universal DAW system, if you have it all on one row, that would be universal and fit more onto a guitar. And going up is kind of like the convention, because rising notes does kind of make sense from a holistic standpoint. Absolute names, relative degrees, and modules. Note names are optional. So in other words, if we tell people to start learning to write in a DAW by just saying you're going to use relative positions with a collection of notes, then they can write in any collection, and transposition is easy, right? It shouldn't matter to someone if they say, oh, could I write the song in B, the collection of notes of B major or C major? It shouldn't matter in a DAW. It only matters on a piano or on a guitar because the fingering's different. But it's all the same. It's all the relative notes. I'm still going to use numbers 1 through 7 for the notes that are in the collection, and then the 5 notes outside of the collection, I use something else. We shouldn't be imposing the problems of our particular instrument, whatever that may be, onto someone using a DAW to learn to do data input. They should just use a 10 key or the typewriter, Mode as afterthought, first class mode dial, so we should be able to rotate the dial. No one row octave, single row octaves lens, so we should be able to have expand or contract. Chromatic 5s are clumsy, built-in 0.5 degrees. In other words, we're not just going to say, oh, you're just playing the 7 notes. We're going to add the 0.5 so they can play all 12 notes from any perspective. Poor interrupt clean import, so we should be able to import the information, whether it be in sheet music, tablature, or whatever. Limited tinkering, 2 dials. So in other words, normal writing has limited tinkering because you're locked in by the way you wrote the information by naming note points instead of relative position modal points, which even if you write by hand is not the way to do it, right? You do it by, if you write your musical ideas by relative modal point, you can tinker with them much more easily, even if it's by hand, turning the dial, transposing the 12 collections, as well as rotating the modal center. So closing thoughts, write once, rotate freely. That's how it should be. You should be able to write the song any way you want and then rotate it so it musically fits like a Rubik's Cube beautifully, right? You should be able to play with it, tinker with it, and that's the way it should be. Hear instantly. Obviously, if it's in a DAW, you should be able to play it back. People that play by ear would love these adjustments. They don't know it maybe yet, but I'm telling you, if you build it, they will appreciate it, I feel like. So the modal number system, relative rotatable, row-based, and ready for AI.